Right. Our topic today is William Blake, or our author, William Blake, and we are going to look at a few of his poems, but we're going to concentrate on his songs of innocence and experience. Now, Blake, I'm going to say a few things, not only about the author Blake, but also about the period in which he is writing, which is commonly called the Romantic period. And I say that because it's called the period because there are certain features of the era that the writers of that time have in common, and where scholars in general speak of eras and periods to help us to understand not just the time in which they wrote, but something of the features of it. At least sometimes that's the case. So at last time when we were looking at Pope and at Swift, I said that they were writing during the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, and they, on the other hand, that they were using neoclassical poetics. And so there were certain features to that. So in the case of Pope and Swift, Pope wrote in rhyming couplets, and that was a feature of neoclassical poetics. They often wrote in rhyming couplets, and it was marked by these appeals to reason, and there's a great deal of trust in human reason during the period, which we saw last time with Swift. Also wrote, gave to rise various concerns about this age of reason and the supposed benefits of thinking rationally and in terms of human utility and so forth, so that Swift was proposing how practical and beneficial it would be to eat the babies of the poor Irish Catholics who were, growing too numerous in their midst. But that era is past now when we come to Blake and the Romantics. And the Romantics are marked, by the way, the designation the Romantics themselves did not call themselves this. First point. Second point, it has nothing to do with romantic in the sense of romantic love, which is sort of confusing, because when we in general use the word romantic, that is what we associate with it. It's a certain type of love that we mean. And we have sort of associations with that. And now those stock associations actually arise in the medieval period, more confusingly. And we saw that last semester with the courtly love tradition. And Dante, writing within the confines of that, expressed some of his concerns about that tradition. And most of them were that they promoted adultery and so forth, so Lancelot and Guinevere and all that. Those are what we think of as romantic, though. The Romantics didn't even write about that. They're not interested in romantic love at all, with few exceptions, actually. What does mark them is an intense interest in the imagination. And they all, I would say, all the major figures of this period place a great deal of interest on this word and its significance and what it does. And the imagination is of particular focus for the artist and his capacity to be imaginative. And it's from this period that we have this idea that artists are imaginative people. It's not the mark of artists historically. That's not what distinguishes a good writer like Homer or Virgil or Dante. It might be there, but it isn't necessarily there. That's not the distinctive feature of the artist, imagination. Let alone the sense of the word that we get from the Romantics onward and associate with the imagination. Well, maybe I can ask you this as a genuine question. When you think of a good artist and the imaginative, what other words would you use to describe that person? So what is if somebody was very imaginative, how else would you describe them? Sure. Creative, sure. Original. And when you say creative, what do you mean by creative? And when you say original, what do you mean by original? I mean, I agree with that's. I'm asking for just your associations, not to justify them, but.
Stepping outside of the literary norm.
Okay.
Or box.
So, new, novelty. Okay. And what's interesting in this period, this is the period in the 18th century when a new literary form arises called the novel. Isn't that interesting? And it's called the novel because it's novel. It's not a genre that exists before. By the way, and this is also interesting, in German and in French, the novel is not a novel, it's a roman. So in English, it's a novel. In French or in German, it's a roman, and roman, romantic, again. And something of novelty, originality, in the sense of newness, never been done, is part and parcel with the new understanding of what an artist does. So there's an element of pure originality. And it's, when I say this is a feature of the period, it is also unprecedented. It was not something that authors before this period even sought to be. They didn't want to be original. They didn't want to think thoughts that nobody else has thought before. They didn't want to invent worlds that didn't exist. They were suggesting, usually when they were telling myths, they were talking about a tale that they genuinely believed resided in the past in some ways. And to be a good artist usually meant following the template of previous artists. And we've traced that in this class by just following the epic as one example of a genre that was passed on by successive generations and used and also adapted and changed in some ways. So we just left off with Paradise Lost and the mock epic, and there are certain epic conventions or features which they understood and all other people understood to be marks of the epic, and yet at the same time there was some freedom to distinguish what you were presenting as your epic from those foregoing epics, but it was a comparative thing then, right? And you would judge an artist on the excellence of his craft or her craft based on a comparison. Like Milton, I think Milton's the greatest epic writer. Statement. Compared to whom? Does he exist on his own? Is he like an island and there are no other people on the island? Is he original in that sense? No, he's courting comparison. We saw that. He said he'd soar high above the Aeonian Mount. The Aeonian Mount is in Greece, where the whole epic tradition begins, and upon which all the others actually rest. But he's going to soar high above it. Now, in a sense, he's saying that his is better, yes, but he's not saying it has no relation to those. If you want to see how great my epic is, look at what I say is epic as compared to what they say is epic. Remember book 9, he said exactly that. I'm not going to write about battles and heroism of knights and so forth. I'm not skilled or studious in writing about those things, but my theme is more heroic in spite of that, because of course it's the heroism of Christ, who didn't defeat his enemies by defeating them in battle. He laid down his life. He gave himself as a ransom for many. There was a new feature of heroism, very much unlike the previous ones, but you can see it by contrasting and comparing the two. So that's the previous notion of an epic, and even creativity. Artists even aren't even interested in being creative, per se, although there's an element of creativity to it. But that's not their first. The only one who is a creator is God. And here's a good way of illustrating it and it's not from English, it's from German. In German, and the translation of, say, Luther's Bible, when they're speaking of the creator, the word that he used, Schöpfer, is the creator. Whereas there's a difference between that and a dichter, a poet. Schöpfen is, as a verb, is only used of God. God alone is capable of Schöpfen, of creation, and creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. In other words, being original, right? Of pure originality, that he didn't need, there was no foregoing materials that he had to work with. He created everything out of nothing. That's why it's important to the Christian doctrine of creation that God didn't begin with something pre-existent like chaos. He created everything that exists out of nothing, and with those materials then things happen. But that's a repository of God's creation alone, that it is original. But come this period, the Romantic artists are claiming the same things of their writing. That's the point here. So there's a higher emphasis on the power of the artist here than any foregoing period. And some regard it as blasphemous, the claim. And certainly, even if we're not going to agree with that description, we will certainly say it's novel. The claims of the artist in this period are unprecedented. And that is beyond dispute, I think. No one will see their own creative powers or regard them quite so highly as the Romantic artist. Now, having said that, and I can't get into that in this class because it goes beyond my scope here to do it too much, all of the artists of this period read and were responding to the previous generations of poets. So all of them wrote epics. So Blake wrote an epic. It was called Milton, interestingly. Keats, who we will look at in a couple of classes, wrote epics as well, Hyperions, 2 Hyperion poems. Shelley, Blake, Byron, Wordsworth, they all wrote epics, and all of them saw Milton as a sort of role model for them. So even when they claimed originality, they were still reading and responding to those that went before them. So their claim of absolute originality and novelty isn't really, it's a little bit of hype, actually. On the other hand, they do want to mark something unique about what they're doing, and that uniqueness is connected with a political event. So this is where I want to go with this. And the political event is the French Revolution. This is the fundamental and vital moment in politics. Thereafter is the French Revolution. And the French Revolution happens in 1789, which incidentally is the year that Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience are published. He writes before this, but these are published in, my understanding, 1789. What happens in the French Revolution? Well, in France, which is the place that is most strongly associated with the Enlightenment and with reasoning, so much so that, let me show you a sense of see if I can get this up for you here. Is this on the screen? So this is the garden in Versailles. Versailles is a palace which the Sun King, Louis XIV, built. It's called the Sun King. He was the sun around the radiance of which other people would be drawn and so forth, the symbol of light, symbol of reason, age of reason. He had this palace which is central to European history. Many peace treaties were signed there in this palace. There's a hall of mirrors in it and so forth. But if you go out into the garden now, you can't get its sense from here because it's looking down from up above, not from the palace. It's probably from a drone or a helicopter or so forth, like it's way above the ground. But if you're standing at ground level, first of all, the palace is on a hill. And you can't see that here, but it's down here, the palace is set on a hill. And if you stand on the palace and just step outside the door, which I've done, and you look out, you see nothing, actually. You see the horizon. So it feels like you're standing on a cloud. And yet there's nothing that breaks the your gaze, you look around and see nothing. So it's set up on high, on a mountain, as it were, and you're observing all that, everything that you observe is, there's nothing there. Your reason penetrates everything, in other words. But then when you look down, as it does here, then you see that the gardens have been laid out in a way that is perfectly symmetrical and geometric and fast, mathematically ordered. And if you drive into the grounds, you find that there are trees, and they're planted at in an equidistant nature, and the trees look exactly the same. Same height, same shape, perfectly manicured. It's a symbol of mathematical perfection, and it expresses the ideal of art in the Enlightenment, which is a sort of a rational ordering of things. And cities built in this period have the same structure. So New York City is a good illustration of an Enlightenment city, even though it's in the New World, or maybe that's why it's in the New World. And that's the idea of the block. So if you go to New York City, there's a First Avenue, a Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth, etc., and it keeps on going on up into the however many, and you know where you are. If you're on Fifth Avenue, you want to get to Sixth Avenue, where do you go? Well, one block up. And it's intersected at equidistant patterns, so there's the so-called square block system. So if you're new to the city, it's easy to find yourself around Manhattan at any rate. It's very easy. Whereas if you go to London, England, or Paris, to a lesser extent, but particularly London, England, or even look at the map of the underground, the subway system there, it looks like a bowl of spaghetti. And so the streets, and something of Toronto is a bit like that as well. Like a street is going along and then it suddenly turns. Why did it turn? Well, there was probably a hill there. So rather than knock the hill down, they just went around it. Or there was a tree there, so they decided, well, we'll just go around to the left, turn left. They don't, knock the tree down, they turn the street rather. Or somebody's house was there. So the street bends to the left, and at that point, the street changes name. It happens in Toronto, it happens even more in London. Those are organic cities. They grew up slowly and they changed over time. These cities, like New York City, are representative of an ideal universal order. And against that rationalism of the Enlightenment, Swift is already pointing out some of the problems with it. It's inhuman. It seems to benefit mankind, but there are serious problems with it. Now, he says, within the Age of Enlightenment, Blake, coming after, is more concerned about it at a profound level. And he sees reason, the way of looking at the world through the eyes of reason, as totally inimical to mankind. It's hostile. He thinks using reasoning is a destructive force. And it's in part because what it does is it gives more power to those in power. And so the French Revolution was exactly that, a perception amongst the common people that those in power had too much power, and they were exerting their power in the name of benefiting humanity, and actually they were crushing humanity. And so there were poor people who had no bread. And Marie Antoinette famously said, well, then let them eat cake. Because she had she had no way of understanding what it meant to be hungry. She'd always had food. Well, they don't have any bread. Well, then let them eat cake, because that's what she would do, because she ate cake all day. Right? She just thought there was a problem of a lack of, well, don't worry about that, just let them have cake. Well, they don't have, no, you don't get it. They have no food. So totally out of touch, detached. That's the French Revolution, and it was the revolution of the common people against the aristocrats. And so it's the common people overthrowing those who are in positions of responsibility and authority. Allegedly, they're benevolent rulers, but in fact not leading them very benevolently. So it's a populist revolt. And all the Romantics, all of them, are sympathetic with the French Revolution. Now, these are English writers. No revolution happened in England. But they're sympathetic to it because the same sense of power growing amongst the wealthy is happening there. And they have sympathies with the common people who are not being looked after by those who are actually, in terms of their vocation and station in life, supposed to be looking after them. So the aristocrats that Swift satirized were not looking after the poor people on their estates, even though it was their duty to, like Lord Grantham in, if you've watched, whatchamacallit, what's that? Downton Abbey, yeah. That's the example of a good landlord. He cares about the people on his estate. They have a role, they have a job, and it's not a job, they have a place within his estate, and it's his job to make sure that they are taken care of and are treated ethically and also with dignity. And they rub shoulders. The commoners come into contact with the aristocrats. They're not detached from them, as if they were a different species of humanity. But this is happening in England, and Blake writes as one of these radicals. And so when he writes these poems, Songs of Innocence and Experience, which are reflecting two sides of the human, what's the subtitle here? Songs of Innocence and Experience, I think, based on the two sides of the human soul. Where's the subtitle? I don't have it here. Something like that. Well, anyway, the songs of there are two different types of poems. The Songs of Innocence is one part, and they're all grouped together. And then when you read the Songs of Experience, it's the counterpart to the Song of Innocence, and often they have the same name. So there's an introduction to the Song of Innocence. You should read the Song of Experience, the introduction, alongside of it. And what it's demonstrating is roughly equivalent to the state of innocence in paradise, as Milton described it, and the state of the fall, as Milton describes it in Book 9 of Paradise Lost. Except Blake doesn't hold to it as Christian doctrine. He sees them as imaginative categories rather than doctrinal categories. Blake is not interested in doctrine, particularly. He's not orthodox in his theology. Me saying that, he would not be offended. He would say that's correct. I am not. Because he thinks all forms of fixity and orthodoxy are sterile and oppressive. The imagination liberates us from such sterility and imaginative oppression. For Blake, the worst thing imaginable is a fixed opinion or a certain doctrine. As soon as you fall into thinking that anything is correct or to be held as a certitude, you're already partaking of the fall. So in other words, what characterizes the Songs of Experience is the misused reason of the Enlightenment. Well, I'll read a couple of the Songs of Innocence, or I'll read one. Let me read the introduction, and then I'll come to the Song of Experience. This is one of the famous Songs of Experience. But note, another feature which is obvious from this image behind me, is that Blake, by profession, was an engraver. So he's an artist, and he's very different than poets that we normally see. He's a graphic artist as well as a poet, and more famous actually for his graphic art than he is for his poetry. His poetry became important probably in the 20th century. During his own age, he was regarded as a little bit of a crazy man, which he may well have been. So among other things, he and his wife used to walk around naked in their backyard, which, okay, fine. But as a sort of a liberation from the oppressive norms of civilization, that sort of stuff. Anyway, we'll go to the introduction here. Songs of Innocence. Let me see if I can reduce this so you can see it on one screen here. So here's the introduction. Let's see if I can follow it here. And no, it's not going to work, so I'll just read it here. piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee. On a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, pipe a song about a lamb. So I piped with merry cheer. Piper, pipe that song again. So I piped, he wept to hear. Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe. Sing thy songs of happy cheer. So I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe. Sing thy songs of happy cheer. So I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed, and I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs every child may joy to hear. Let me make some comments about this. I'm going to reduce it. I'm sorry if you can't see it at the back here. I always could come forward if you want, and I'm not sure I can reduce it, but yes, I can. To try and get it on one page here. Yes, there we go. Just a few comments. So first of all, note how easy to understand the poem is, first of all. It's the diction, the choice of words is simple and easy to understand. One of the reasons these poems are popular is because everybody gets them, right, immediately. No, you're not struggling for vocabulary. In general, he also uses words that are English, Anglo-Saxon in their roots, that there's an earthiness to his vocabulary. He doesn't use Latinic words or Greek words. He tends to use Anglo-Saxon words, and those always have a sort of a resonance to them. Thirdly, it's highly repetitive, and it's childlike in that sense. The vocabulary is limited, and it's repetitive, and children are not unhappy about being repetitive. So there's a piper, and the piper's piping. So there's a noun, a piper. He plays a pipe, and he's also, with the verb, piping. Doesn't say playing. He could replace piping with playing, but he wants to keep using the word pipe. So pipe, 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 all over the place. And furthermore, the figures that are in it are very basic and associated with rural life. So there's a child, and they're also figures of innocence. There's a child, there's a lamb, there's a pipe, there's water, there are reeds, all things that you'll find in the natural environment, right? But there's there's a rhyme scheme in it as well, which is pretty simple and basic, but you can see it for yourself. Wild glee, child me. A, B, lamb, cheer, again, here. It's roughly, counts as rhyme, by the way, lamb and again. It sounds close enough. Pipe, cheer, again, here. Write, read, cite, read. Pen, clear, songs, here. Now he breaks the here, by the way, the songs, which, if you've picked up the pattern, should draw your attention to it. Whenever an artist establishes a pattern and then breaks it, it strikes the reader. And an attentive reader will say, hold on a second, he broke the rhyme scheme entirely here. What's going on? Because why would he do that? Would he not be able to find something that rhymed with pen? And the answer is surely. It's not hard to rhyme with pen in English. Could have called it a fen or a den or men or a hen. I mean, I'm not prepared. I could give you 50 words monosyllabic that have N in it in English, right? 10. So he intentionally moves away from that here. So the Song of Innocence is obviously dealing with a certain theme. Let's talk about the progression in this poem then, and the sense of movement and what happens here. So again, there's a child, but note he sees the child on a cloud, which is a strange sort of thing. It's almost like a heavenly sight. He sees the child on a cloud. Well, children aren't on clouds. Well, what sort of children are on clouds? Well, if you look at painting from the Renaissance period, you often have little fat children, even angels, right? They look like babies that have had too much to eat and not enough exercise, right? Maybe that sort of child. So an angelic association with those, maybe that's the picture, I don't know. But he sees the child, and the child's joyous, he's laughing. And then what does the child say to the piper? Piper's song about a lamb, now it's capitalized. And anyone who comes from a Christian country, as Blake's compatriots were, would associate the lamb here with the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. Jesus, in other words. Piper's song about a lamb. So it's a child that's on a cloud, suggesting heavens, asking the piper to pipe a song about a lamb. Okay. And Blake probably had in mind here the songs of Isaac Watts. Isaac Watts had moral songs for children, and Blake hated them, by the way. Absolutely despised. Watts is one of the great hymnists of the 18th century, along with Wesley. Wesley and Watts penned terrific hymns, but his songs for children, Blake hated, because they were moralizing and so forth, and Blake hated moralizing. Above all other things, he hated moralizing. So it's almost a response to that. It's sort of, he intends a Christian audience with his poetry, and yet he wants to speak to it with something better than moralizing, in his view. But at any rate, the piper does what the child asks. I piped with merry cheer. Piper, pipe that song again, so I piped. He wept to hear. Now it's interesting. So it goes from cheer to tears very quickly, reflecting in some ways something true about the human psyche, which is often when we're at our most joyful, we're often crying. Right? You've been there, like you laugh so loud at something that you tears start coming. Well, this is a sign. Why are you crying? Are you sad? No, I'm not. I am not. And the other way around, actually. Sometimes when you're under extreme pressure or extremely distressed, you can start laughing out of some sort of a release. I'm not exactly sure. But the sense of joy and suffering often are linked in some ways. That's the expression here, that the child is weeping to hear it. We're not told why. He doesn't get into causal explanations. He simply observes. And I would say that's characteristic of all the songs of innocence. There's no looking at causes. That goes too far. That's the way adults think. They want an explanation for everything. Songs of Innocence never gives explanations. Children don't understand explanations. They might ask you why something is, but it doesn't even have to be plausible. They're saying why because they hear adults asking why. They're not interested really, per se. Anyway, then the child commands him, drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer. Maybe he didn't like the piping. Who knows? So I sung the same again. Now note, he now goes to songs, and note that the song which he was piping is an instrumental one. Now I want to hear the human voice. Was the child weeping because he was playing on an instrument and not using a human voice? I don't know. But he does go to that. Note the songs are the last word that breaks the scheme down here. I'm just noting why it is. That's another question, but just note. Sing this. So I sung the same again. Well, he wept with joy to hear. So he again weeps, but this time we're told it's with joy. Combining the joy from above with the weeping here. The turning point is here in the fourth stanza. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book. Now, other thing I want you to know, this is the first line in which the line runs into the next one. There's no punctuation here, it jams. It runs over. Write in a book. And you pause and you stop at the comma. And that's how you're supposed to read, by the way, even in poetry. If there's no comma, punctuation at the end, you read over into the next line without a pause. And you write in a book. Well, there is a sort of a formal break there in the sense that the line ends, but it's not it doesn't really break until it ends in the book. And something I'm going to suggest problematic has happened here. Rather than simply expressing joyfully, emotionally, without reflection, when you write in a book, there has to be a deliberation. It's a conscious thing. And the aim of the reason why you write is to preserve it, for others to be able to read it. And it's no longer your song, it's somebody else's song. It's not original anymore. Right? It's a copy of somebody else's thoughts, and you can read those thoughts, but they're no longer a product of your own joy. Somebody else's song. And as soon as he does that, and the rationale is given that, and a cause, a purpose, why? That all may read. Okay, that's a rational explanation, a good reason to write something in the book. Yes, but at that point, the child vanishes. And even though this is a song of innocence, there's a sense that innocence has been lost. At that point, the child vanishes from his sight. And the man takes over. The piper, who's an adult. And what does he do? He plucks a hollow weed. He takes a natural object and takes it and breaks it. Right? Reeds are used for pens, and here it is a pen. And he makes of it, in fact, a rural pen. And he stained the water clear, a sense that the environment has been despoiled in some way. And I wrote my happy songs, every child may joy to hear. Now this breaks, as I say, the rhyme scheme here when he writes his songs. He's not singing his songs, he's writing his songs. So these are very subtle ways in which a very simple poem has an underlying complexity, and it expresses the themes that we'll see are common for all of Blake's writing. The emphasis on originality, on personal expression, imagination, and the problems when the imagination ends when you start writing. As soon as you start writing, it ceases to be a work of imagination, and now it's a product. And Blake is going to be critical of all of that. So because Blake regards the imagination as a divine faculty, not only divine in him, but divine in everyone. To be human is to be imaginative for Blake. As soon as you cease being imaginative, and try to be rational and explain everything, you start to become inhuman. And we'll see that played out in his poetry. But that was the Song of Innocence introduction. Now we'll come to the Song of Experience introduction. A bard is a poet. Often referred, Shakespeare is called the bard, but a bard is a poet. And it's not only referring to Shakespeare, but I'll read the poem, and read this in thinking of what we just read. Hear the voice of the bard, who present, past, and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees, calling the lapsed soul and weeping in the evening dew, that might control the starry pole and fallen light renew. O earth, return, arise from out the dewy grass. Night is worn, and the morn rises from the slumberous mass. Turn away no more. Why wilt thou turn away? The starry floor, the watery shore, is given thee till the break of day. So this is the introduction to the Songs of Experience. Compare and contrast. Who's the speaker? A poet, a bard. Where's the child? Nowhere to be seen. The perspective is dealing with things. The language is far more complex, I would say as well. Far less repetitive, far more cosmic in its scope rather than localized. He's not talking about experiences or thoughts that even occur to most people. It's talking about big picture stuff. When he's talking about the bard here, he's talking, it almost sounds like God, because the bard sees past, present, and future, just like we saw God in Milton's Paradise Lost, Book 3, right? Who doesn't foresee, he sees everything at once, because he's not limited by space and time. So the bard here is a sort of a godlike figure. But it's not God, because his ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees. And the holy word, capitalized, is surely a reference to God, right? John 1 speaks of, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's the holy word that walked among the ancient trees. Maybe a reference to the visitation of Abraham by 3 angelic visitors walking. Or is it referring to the holy word walking among the ancient trees in the Garden of Eden? So Adam, remember they heard him in the cool, walking in the garden, and then they went and hid themselves because they were afraid? Reference to that? Probably. In which case the bard there is an Adamic figure. And Adam, as we know, falls. He doesn't just remain innocent. Now we're speaking of a man. And this bard is speaking of a world which is no longer innocent but falling, and he's calling in particular the lapsed soul, the soul that's fallen away from faithfulness to God and observing the goodness of the world and speaking of the fallenness of everything. So, and he's weeping again. Remember a reference back to the weeping of the previous poem? With joy? There's no joy in this weeping. It's not a mixed thing. It's weeping in the evening dew. It's not the morning, it's not the day, it's in the evening. There's a darkness is setting in. Calling the lapsed soul, and I think the soul is probably the object of that here, because the that is referring to something, and I suspect it's referring to the soul. The lapsed soul that might control the starry pole and fallen light renewed. So the soul who has the capacity to renew the earth and exercise a godly, imaginative dominion over the earth is not doing such a thing. And maybe the voice of the bard here, the voice of experience, it might be Blake himself, whose ears have heard the holy word. Because Blake has an allegiance to Christ. He sees Christ as, by the way, so his phrase for the Bible, he calls the Bible a great work of imagination and the great code of all Western art. He calls it the great code. So all artists utilize the Bible as this great imaginative work for their own way of looking at the world. So the bard here may well be Mr. Blake. And calling these souls, and they're lapsed, in what way are they lapsed? Lapsed means fallen. But it's a complicated way of speaking of it that way. And what does the poet say to this soul? O earth, return. So he's calling not only on people, Milton, in his Paradise Lost, he's calling on mankind to repent. And for people to follow God and have faith in him and to exercise their dominion over the earth in obedience to Christ. This poet is not interested only in the souls, he's interested in the created order as well. So he's an environmentalist, if you will. So, O earth, return. Arise from out the dewy grass. Reference to this again. Night is worn, and the morn rises from the slumberous mass. Turn away no more. Now turn away. The word repent in both its original Hebrew and Greek sense and English sense means to turn around. So Adam and Eve, after the fall, they're made to face God, and they behold God. And one day in heaven we will behold God face to face and say, but the sinner turns his back on God. That's the natural postulate of mankind after the fall. We are fleeing God, hiding from God, with our backs to God. even though we ought to be facing him, we don't face him. To repent just means turn around. Look to God again. Stop looking to yourself. Stop looking to your own agenda. Right? So the turn away no more is stop being self-absorbed and rationally obsessed and following your own agenda. Why wilt thou turn away? The starry floor, the watery shore is given thee till the break of day. So I suspect this is Mr. Blake, who's the bard being spoken of here, and it fits his vocation as a poet, which is to imaginatively renew the world. And this is another feature of the Romantic poets. And I won't say too much more about it right now, but they're also often associated with nature. Poets of nature. William Wordsworth in particular, will come to Wordsworth next class, in which nature has a very strong voice, and it's the voice that is recognizable to us. So I said that the view of creativity of the Romantics is ours, originality. So is the view of nature that the Romantics have, which is this holy place that we are despoiling by existing, basically, and by growing and accumulating in cities. So the countryside becomes a holy place and the city's a wicked place. That's a very Romantic view. So if you want to get closer to God, you go to out to nature. My question, why do so many people in the summer go to Muskoka to experience God? Is God not in the city? God's everywhere. And yet we go to cottage country. Nothing wrong with going to cottage country, but you get closer to God by going where the water is and the trees? The answer is no, by the way, in case you didn't know. But many people think that it is. Well, this is a Romantic sensibility. I'll say more about that next time, but we'll just leave it at that for now. So that's the song of experience that corresponds to it, and roughly speaking, it has, you need to read the two alongside one another, and you'll see some of the resonances here. So what am I going to talk about? Let's go to the Lamb, because this is famous. So this is a song of Innocence. It's called the Lamb. The song of experience that corresponds to it is called the Tiger, wherever that is, right there. But we'll go to the Lamb first. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead, gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly, bright, gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek, and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child, and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. Simple poem, again. Jesus is called the Lamb of God, right? He calls the little children unto him. Don't impede them. Don't oppose them. Allow the children to come to him. He's the Lamb of God. The Lamb of God in Jewish thinking has associations of sacrifice. At the Passover feast, a lamb is prepared, sacrificed. When he calls himself the Lamb of God, or John says, there I see the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world, he's already implying that he has come to die. Jesus doesn't look woolly. He doesn't have white hair. He doesn't have curly hair. It's not a descriptive phrase. It's his understanding and the meaning of what his cousin Jesus has come to do. John knows why Jesus has come. So that sense here, but the child does not know this. The child doesn't understand a lamb as a figure of sacrifice, of atonement. He simply knows that in English often children are called little lambs because they're small and they're cute and they fall down and they're fairly helpless and they can't look after themselves. So those associations. And he will say to the little lamb that he and the lamb are very much alike. And after all, Jesus said that he's a lamb and he's like this, and he calls himself this. So the child's understanding of Christian doctrine is very rudimentary. In fact, there is no understanding at all. And so that's an aspect of innocence as well, is a lack of mature reflection on the meaning of things, and it's a more of a basic one. Now, here's the question. When Blake is presenting his songs of innocence and experience, is he saying that one is better than the other? You might think he was, but he's not. For Blake, innocence is a period in life, and experience is a period in life, and you cannot remain innocent. Not possible. And to seek to remain innocent is to resist change and to think that innocence is of itself a good thing. And this is not true. That will make you think like a child when you no longer are a child. And adults don't think the way that children do. But there is something distinctive about this. Now, Blake sees this as two contrary parts of the human soul. I think that's the subtitle of Songs of Innocence and Experience. He's displaying those. Now, these are true of small children, for sure, to think along these things. But note again how this is more complicated than the introduction, for sure. But again, it's highly repetitive, and in this case, we've got rhyming couplets even, right? Thee, feed, me, delight, bright, voice, rejoice, thee, the name, lamb, mild child, lamb, name, thee. Rhyming couplets throughout. And in addition to that, highly repetitive. Little lamb, I'll tell thee, repeat it. Little lamb, God bless thee, repeat it at the end of that one. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? And again, question marks. So intense repetition and also variation. Two of the great principles of art, repetition and variation. So it was a very simple, and the simplicity gives it is the very thing that gives it its power, I would submit. But the tender voice that he gives the lamb makes all the veils rejoice is ascribing to the lamb the same sort of power that Christ has in his voice. I just this morning was teaching C.S. Lewis class, and I was looking at the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, normally the godlike figure in it is Aslan, who's a lion, right? In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he appears in two other guises. One of them is as an albatross. And I'll come to that when we come to Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He's referring to an albatross there, but Lewis picks that up, and the albatross speaks in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But another is they see a little lamb, and the little lamb is speaking. And it's Aslan. At first they hear the lamb, and then at the end of that speech he starts roaring, and then they realize that it's the lion, and it is the lion. He's the lion who is the lamb. Now that is portrayed in the book of Revelation. He hears a lion roaring, and he turns about and he sees a lamb as if it had been slain. The Lamb of God is the Lion of Judah. That association of those two things. Now I say this because this is a good way of transitioning from the Song of Innocence, which is about a lamb, to the Song of Experience, which is not about a lion, but about a tiger and the fierceness. Now, why does Blake not write about a lion, since it's a biblical thing? I don't know. Maybe because he doesn't want it to be sounding too Christian and too orthodox. He wants to deal with two contrary sides of the human soul rather than sounding like Christian doctrine per se. That's my best guess. Because the tiger, which is perhaps an even more famous poem than the lamb, or is rather, actually. I'll read it to you. The innocence of the lamb. How about the tiger? Is a tiger an experienced beast and a lamb not? I mean, a lamb is, of course, a baby sheep, I guess, so but tigers are not, strictly speaking, experienced. They're fierce, whereas lambs are gentle. So it's two different sides, fierceness. And both are associated with God, by the way. The gentleness of the lamb that is sacrificed for the sins of the world, and on the other hand, the lion of the tribe of Judah who roars and is not a tame lion, to use C.S. Lewis's words from the Narnia Chronicles. And the fierceness of God and the fact that he can't be tamed is reflected in this song of experience. It's called the tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? First stanza is the same as the last one. Oh, I can't get it on one page, or I can if I shrink it, so I'll do that once more. All right, so this is exactly correspondent to this. References, there are biblical references throughout. Blake's assuming that we are picking them up. The reference here to the stars throwing down their spears and watering heaven with their tears is the battle in heaven that Milton spoke of and began Paradise Lost with. The conclusion of that, which is Satan and his rebel angels being thrown down to hell. But the actual battle is in books 5 and 6 of Paradise Lost, which Blake read regularly. It's the war in heaven that's spoken of in the book of Revelation, in Isaiah and various other places. When he did such an awesome thing as to crush his foes in heaven and throw them down in the pit, that God, and who is that the same God that created the little lamb? And what does it say about the character of God, that he should be capable of creating such a fierce beast as well as such a innocent, gentle beast? So when we say this is a song of experience, it's the experience that actually sometimes God's hand is not soft and gentle, but fierce and terrifying. It's easy to introduce children to the first. How about the latter? I think they need to have both, because they will find very quickly that the world isn't all cute and cuddly, and that they meet terrible things that they can't explain other than through there's a terrible battle being waged on earth, and it's useful to know that God is not only involved in the gentle, comfortable things, but also the fierce ones. That's the portrait of the tiger. And what sort of God is this? And what is he like if that's the case? to some degree, this is the question that pops up in the book of Job. When Job, if you recall, if you haven't read it, Job starts off very blessed, praising God, and everything is taken away from him. His family is killed. He's blighted by sores. And then like a terribly grief-stricken man, and Satan has been allowed to do this to him by God. And because God says to Satan, look at my servant Job, a blameless, upright man. And Satan says, oh yeah, that's just because he's being treated well. You take everything away from him and he will curse you. So he's only praising you because he's got it good. But if you take away all the things, so he's doing it because of its utility to him, not because he really cares about you. He says, okay, go ahead. You can do what you want with him, just don't take away his life. So he does. He takes away everything. And then his friends come in, 3 friends, and his friends accuse him of misunderstanding God and not knowing what God is really like, because after all, God would not treat good people in a bad way. Dealing with the problem of pain and the problem of suffering, right? And they're accusing him, and Job says it's not true. I have done nothing wrong. This did not come because of something I've done. They don't believe him because they don't understand that God brings suffering also to those who serve him. So it's an interesting. And by the time the accusers, the 3 so-called comforters, have finished, God comes in and speaks, because Job starts getting more and more distressed, and he starts accusing God. You did this. You allowed this to happen. And then God reveals himself in a sort of a phase of great imaginative power and talks about, were you there when I called all the stars by name and they sang for joy? And were you there when I created the Leviathan and the behemoth, these great sea beasts? I mean, were you there? Were you there? Have you been there when the eagles were born and all those sorts of things? So this sort of sense of, my ways are not your ways, you don't understand all things. You understand your pain, you understand the nature of the world in a small way, but you don't understand all things. And at the end of it all, Job repents of what he said, and God then accuses his accusers of misunderstanding who he is, and he restores everything to Job. But the reason I say that is, this is the sort of thing that he's reflecting in the tiger. There's a fierceness in the world which is not a sign of a different God than the one who created the lamb. It's the same one. And both are necessary for us to hold on to the power of God and also the kindness there. So anyway, I think it's quite brilliant. Famous poem. Let's try another one. Some of these get really interesting. Let's look at, I don't want to run out of time, Little Black Boy. Now, Blake writes this at a time when the slave trade was still going on. Blake, like many of his contemporaries, was adamantly opposed to the slave trade. William Wilberforce is in Parliament at this time trying to abolish it. It takes 30 years for him to do it, because it's highly lucrative. Highly lucrative. But there's a coalition of many who are Christians, and many others who say, no, this has to stop. We have to stop this. And Blake is speaking to the social ill here of the little black boy. Now, he's just talking about a little black boy here. And remember, this is the Song of Innocence. We'll come to the Song of Experience. My mother bore me in the southern wild, and I am black, but oh, my soul is white. White as an angel is the English child, but I am black, as if bereaved of light. My mother taught me underneath a tree, and sitting down before the heat of day, she took me on her lap and kissed me, and pointing to the east began to say, look on the rising sun, there God does live, and gives his light, and gives his heat away, and flowers and trees and beasts and men receive comfort in morning, joy in the noonday. And we are put on earth a little space, that we may learn to bear the beams of love. And these black bodies and this sunburnt face are but a cloud, and like a shady grove. For when our souls have learned the heat to bear, the cloud will vanish. We shall hear his voice, saying, "Come out from the grove, my love and care, and round my golden tent like lambs rejoice." Thus did my mother say, and kissed me. And thus I say to little English boy, when I from black, and he from white cloud free, and round the tent of God like lambs we joy, I'll shade him from the heat, till he can bear to lean in joy upon our Father's knee. And then I'll stand and stroke his silver hair, and be like him, and he will then love me. Powerful, extraordinarily powerful poem. Why is it so powerful? He's not angry. The little black boy has a very, and his mother has a very simple explanation. And it's one, like, why are some people white? Why are some people black? She doesn't have an explanation. But she points out that it allows them to bear the sun, and the sun is, and the beams of love are the light. Jesus is the light of the world, and that allows them to be present in the light more, and so they're closer to God, as opposed to the suggestion of the slavers that these are not human people, and therefore we can trade them as slaves. And the little English boy has imbibed from his culture that he is superior to them in some way, because if he didn't think he was so, then he wouldn't trade them. Now Blake is writing this is the song of innocence, and in the end, the voice of the innocent here is the little black boy. And the little black boy is not only innocent and not condemning the terrible atrocity of slavery, he is also willing to shade the boy from the heat when he comes in the presence of God. And at that point, he will love me. So, but it's savage in its satire. It's absolutely savage. Only when I do him good will he then love me. Not because of who I am. There's no reference to the image of God, none of that stuff, but it's implied there. And Blake is suggesting superiority, in fact, in proximity to God by virtue of the black skin. Totally contrary to the slavers' doctrine and practice. Not that they probably even think about it much. This is just money. They're peddlers of flesh. I'm going to skip over it without commenting more. You can say a lot about it, but I don't want to I want to get through more of them here. The little black boy now. Now, where can I see this? I'm not sure there's a correspondence here again. No, I'll go to the chimney sweeper. This is a song of innocence. Again, I'll come to the song of experience. I'm going to go through these really quickly now. Chimney sweepers, by the way, were poor boys usually. If you ever saw Mary Poppins, chimney sweepers were sent down chimneys. And chimneys were big then, not like our chimneys in our little houses. They were places for the rich, and they would get the problem with the smoke, and it would be coal fires. The coal, the carbonization sticks to the side of the chimney, and they get closer and closer, and you get chimney fires, and the whole house can burn down as a consequence of that. So you send a sweeper down to sweep out the coal, which is grown up inside of it. And the people that get to do this are small boys, because you have to be small enough to fit down there. And they shave their heads to get them down there, because otherwise so much soot gets in their hair they can't get it out. So they get, they have hair like mine, except tighter even. Heads are shaven, little boys, and poor. And their parents use them to get money, because the parents are poor. It's sort of like the Irish peasants, but now these are the poor English kids, and they go down there, and their parents get wealthy from that, or get some means of sustenance, but the boys die when they're young because they're inhaling the dust of the coal in their lungs. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me, while yet my tongue could scarcely cry. Weep, 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 weep. He can't say sweep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head, that curled like a lamb's back, was shaved. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. And so he was quiet. And that very night, as Tom was a-sleeping, he had such a sight, that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing, they run and wash in a river and shine in the sun. Then, naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So, if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. This is the sort of song that he's parodying Isaac Watts. You know, children, be dutiful, be obedient, whatever, as if there wasn't a problem of sin in parents, in exploitation there by adults. And this is what's happening in Blake's day now. He's using it not so much against Watts as against the people who are singing Watts hymns in churches and sending little boys down the chimneys and telling them it's okay that we exploit you and that you die young, because one day you'll receive a heavenly recompense and so forth. So he's decrying the practice there. Now, note that it's done with, again, no hint of condemnation, because innocent children don't get bitter. That comes later. But there's already the hints and the seeds that will become bitter about the treatment and the ill treatment, the fact that they're not being treated as children of God, but rather being treated as commodities. Let's look at the Song of Experience that corresponds with it. Very short, very sweet. I'll come to the question in 2 seconds. Let me read this. A little black thing among the snow, crying weep, weep, in notes of woe. Where are thy father and mother? Say, they are both gone up to the church to pray. Because I was happy upon the heath, and smiled among the winter's snow, they clothed me in the clothes of death, and taught me to sing the notes of woe. And because I am happy and dance and sing, they think they have done me no injury, and are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who made up a heaven of our misery. This is the little black boy, or rather the chimney sweeper, who's black from soot. And again, note how he's touching on the same sort of child, lamb, black boy. But now the boy's blackened by the soot. So it's very clever in the way in which he's interacting. Do you have a question on the previous one, or a comment?
The text you just read is in the book.
It varies from that?
But the first text you read varied.
Yes,
Text
but not this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are sometimes different variations. I don't know which one this was online, I'm sorry. But yeah.
But we have this.
I know that the Song of Innocence was different. And sometimes there are variations based on different manuscripts. So sorry for that. I was trying to put one that was on the overhead for everyone, but anyway. It's the same general thrust, though. And note the reference to the church now, the church being a place that ought to uphold God's goodness and righteousness, now being used for hypocrisy, the whitewashed people that go there. Let me come to one final poem, and then I'm going to try and play a song for you, which is sung in England, and it's from the preface to Blake's poem Milton. The poem I want to look at is from the Song of Experience. It's called London. which is a city. This is a song of experience. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, a mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down the palace walls. But most, through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, ear it is actually, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. This is a dark poem describing the London in which Blake grew up, by the way. This is the onset, it's not yet here, of people accumulating in the cities. The Industrial Revolution has not yet happened. Eventually it will, and what he says will resonate that much more strongly. But note this, the repetition here, in every, and even in the bands. The bands are said of marriage. When you're about to get married, it's announced in the church that these people intend to get married. They're to be read 3 times. And if any, and at the beginning of the service, the minister says, if anyone has any reasons why these two shall not lawfully marry, speak now or forever hold your peace. But the bands are proclaiming it's going to happen. So a good event. But he even hears in that proclamation of a marriage feast, the mind-forged manacles, chains. The chains of thinking the way adults do, of having no imagination, of following the rules, of not thinking about what's going on, about the terrible atrocity of, for Blake, and he associates them all together, of chartering the Thames, making it a commodity. And the streets, which are chartered, they have names on them. Everything is being made into a thing and something that you have power over. And he refers back again to the chimney sweeper and the black church and the soldiers, blood running down the palace walls, the Palace of Versailles probably. But most of all, in the harlot's curse. So this is the prostitute who's had a baby. And the first sound that the baby hears is her mother cursing. Baby cries when they're born, and the response is the adult woman cursing the child that's come from her. And it's not a marriage. Now it's a marriage hearse. A hearse is what carries away a dead body. So the depravity and the fallenness of London. So this is a song of experience. Now you can see if you compare all of them, they're varying types of experience. Some of them are extraordinarily dark. Some of them are decrying social evil. Others are simply talking about the voice looking at things differently as an adult. And they're 2 different sides. And he's associating them with a certain perspective on life. And there's a badness there that's even creeping in the introduction of the Song of Innocence, right? He plucked a rural pen and he stained it and the child disappeared and that sort of thing. There's already that sense of you can't hold on to innocence, and it's falling and so forth, and it's up to the poet to restore it and so forth. But I'll finish off with that. And I'll have to maybe pick it up with my intended song for next time. This is from Blake's wonderful, it's from the movie Chariots of Fire, but the poem, or the song, is called Jerusalem. It's sung at national occasions in England. And I can't even see it, but you can hear the song now. Did those feet in ancient times walk along England's That's too soft. You feel free to go. built among those dark satanic hills. Talking about Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, but England as a Jerusalem that's a fallen one. So anyway, I'll pick it up next time. It's my son's favorite movie, by the way, bizarrely.